Good morning, fifth graders. Today our first read aloud will be 30 Minutes Over Oregon. This is our second text in the conflict resolution. And our essential question today is, what can we do to resolve conflict and find peace? So we need to answer that question. What can we do to resolve conflict and peace? Our goal for today is to infer the author's attitude toward the topic and his purpose in writing about the topic. So that is what we will be looking at for today. So when you think of a war story, what do you expect to read about? Bombing? Destruction? What comes to mind? 30 Minutes Over Oregon by Mark Tyler Nobleman is a war story. It's nonfiction, which means it's a true story. But this is a war story and a twist. What you expect might not be what you get. I'll start with the prologue. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, an American naval base on Hawaii. The surprise attack killed thousands of soldiers and brought America into World War II. To retaliate, the U.S. bombed Tokyo from the sky. This became known as the Doolittle Raid, which would later be memorialized in both a book and film called The 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. In response, Japan set out to prove that continental America, though far from all World War II combat, could also be bombed. This is the story of what happened next. 30 miles off the Oregon coast on September 9, 1942, Nobu Fujita strode across the slippery deck of a submarine. He gripped the 400-year-old samurai sword that he had been in his family for generations. "Come on," he told his navigator. "It will soon be sunup." They climbed into a small plane that was all about to be launched, be catapulted toward the United States. As he did before every flight, Nobu strapped the sword to his seat for luck. Crew members loaded 168-pound bombs under each wing of the plane. The Japanese hoped that the bombs would start a fire that would consume the Oregon woods, then rage into nearby towns and cities. "Do not tell anyone," Nobu commander had told him. "Not even your wife." So instead of sharing with Ioka what Japan had entrusted him to do, Nobu left strands of hair and fingernail clippings for her to bury if he didn't make it back. If the American military shot at him, his plane would not be fast enough to evade being hit. And that's a picture of Nobu. The catapult flung the plane off the sub with a hard whoosh. So a catapult is a device that can launch a projectile or an aircraft at high speed without the use of explosives. Staring into the rising sun, Nobu scanned the sky for American fighters, but saw none. When he flew over the tiny town of Brookings, Oregon, some of the residents heard the motor. Few saw the plane puttering through the fog, but almost none suspected it was an enemy aircraft. Shortly after 6 a.m., high above the thickly wooded mountains 9 miles east of Brookings, Nobu gave his navigator the order. "The bombs are to be dropped here." Nobu wheeled the plane over his shoulder. He caught sight of a white flash below. He beelined back to the ocean, flying low enough to clip tree tops. He landed on the water, and the sub crew hoisted the plane aboard with a crane. They quickly removed the wings and floats and stowed everything in a watertight hangar. The sub then dove 250 feet. Meanwhile, the forest was burning a bit. Only one of the two bombs had exploded, sparking patches of fire that didn't spread. The ground was too damp from recent rain. The other bomb had buried itself on impact without a trace. 4 men from Forest Lookout Station spotted smoke and trudged several hours to the remote site and extinguished the flames. They figured the fire was caught by lightning, but they noticed a splintered tree and beneath it a small pit and a circle of scorched earth, widening the pit into a crater. They uncovered metal fragments, some had markings in Japanese. The news that a foreign foe had flown in and out of American airspace undetected zipped through Brookings. Townsfolk were shaken, but many were more concerned for their relatives fighting overseas. Several newspapers put forth the notion that the plane may have taken off from a sub, but this was dismissed as improbable. The military assumed that the incident was isolated and did little to increase the efforts to defend the coast. 20 days after the bombing, Naboo did it again. Same plan, same plane. Only that time for greater speed, he went by night. To protect coastal communities from becoming easy targets, the U.S. military routinely ordered blackouts during the war, but the lighthouse at Cape Blanca remained lit and guided to shore by its beam. Naboo headed to a wooded area north of Brookings and dropped 2 more bombs on Oregon. On his return, Naboo could not locate the sub. Nearly out of fuel, he resigned himself to dying with honor by winging back and crashing to the lighthouse. The mission comes first, the sub next, he said to his navigator. We come last. But a moment later, he glimpsed a dark, snaky shimmer on the ocean swells, an oil leak from his sub. The Japanese believed the second 2 bombs had detonated. Americans scoured the woods but found no fragments and no damage, or if they did, they kept quiet about it. Either way, Japan claimed both invasions as victorious. They had caught America off guard. After years at war, Naboo returned to Japan, anxious to rejoin Ioka and their young son and daughter, Yoshi and Yoriko. As his ship pulled into his home, Naboo gazed through binoculars to mask his tears. In 1945, Japan surrendered to the United States and its allies, ending World War II. Naboo opened a hardware store and lived quietly in a Tokyo suburb. He never discussed his organ raids, though they were rarely out of his mind, and the residents of Brookings largely forgot about the close call until 1962. So the author is showing us a little more about who Nobu Fuji is. How would you describe him? That year, the Brookings JCs, a leadership organization, was looking for a way to boost tourism to their sleepy burg. One member had a bold idea. He suggested that they track down the Japanese bomber pilot and invite him to attend their annual Memorial Day festival as a great honor of honor. And so they did. To their surprise, Naboo accepted their invitation, and they weren't the only ones who were shocked. This was the first Naboo's family had heard of what he had done in America. One U.S. newspaper published a petition condemning the idea. Those with signs felt that any soldier saluted in Brookings should be American. Furthermore, it would be expensive to fly over Naboo, Ayoko, and Yoshi, now 26, who would act as a translator. Despite the pressure to cancel the visit, the JCs didn't give in. Welcoming Naboo, they announced, would be a symbol of reconciliation, not just between individuals, but between nations. Another newspaper printed a letter from a veteran who wrote, "He was doing a job and we were doing a job." Other veterans, including the governor of Oregon and President John F. Kennedy, also praised the invitation. Protesters began to open their minds. So it can be hard for enemies to reconcile after war. What do you think made it easier for the Americans to offer to reconcile? Why do you think some people protested? Yet Naboo was nervous. Initially, he had feared that Americans were tricking him into coming so they could put him on trial as a war criminal. He worried that they would insult him, egg him, beat him, but he knew he had to go no matter what. It would be impolite to refuse, he said. Again, he brought his family forward. This time, however, it was not for luck. Over the years, Naboo's war pride had shriveled into guilt. His brother had been lost in battle. His country had suffered catastrophically. when the United States dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and though his bombings hadn't hurt anyone, that had been the intention. If the people of Brookings accepted the apology he planned, he would gift the sword to the town. If they did not, he would use the sword to commit seppuku, traditional Japanese suicide by a person overcome with shame. Yikes. So seppuku is an old tradition in Japan. It's a drastic step to take. So this is definitely drastic. A large group of people awaited his arrival at the airport. To his relief, they greeted him and his family not with anger but with warmth. Just during the jetliner he'd flown in, Nabu said in good spirit, "A little larger than the plane in which I made my first flight." During the festival parade, an official introduced the Fujidas, who bowed 3 times to the applauding crowd. Nabu shook the hand of a 6-year-old boy who said he wished to visit Japan. At a banquet in Nobu's honor, Nabu and Yoshi handed over the sword which the library would display. "I never imagined I would be back in Japan alive after my flight over America," Nabu said softly, "and I never dreamed I could visit the United States again." Later, Nabu met one of the men who had put out his fire. "You're one of the worst fire setters in the world," the man said. "If you're going to set another fire, do the same good job." A local pilot flew Nabu over the wilderness he had bombed and let him take the controls for a short while. Before leaving America, Nabu said he would like to host Brookings residents in Japan one day. So did the Americans accept his apology? How do you know? How do you know he accepted the apology? That day came 23 years later, at Nobu's expense. 3 Brookings High School students traveled to Japan. Accompanying them was the now-grown boy from the 1962 parade. For a week, Nabu toured his guests around his country. Their goodbyes were awash with emotion. "The war is finally over for me," Nabu said. So, Nabu says the war is finally over for him. What does that mean to you? What is he trying to say? Nabu made 3 more trips back to Brookings. At a party in 1990, he was served a large submarine sandwich topped with a plain made of sliced pickles and a half-olive helmet. Nabu did not speak English, but everyone understood his reaction. In 1992, one day ahead of the 50th anniversary of his first bombing, he planted a tree sitting at the bomb site. In 1995, a pilot again flew him over the forest and gave him a brief chance to fly the plane himself. Nabu donated thousands of dollars to the town, specifically so the library could buy children's books that celebrate other cultures. He wondered if World War II would have been different if had his generation grown up reading books like those. In 1997, Brookings got word that Nabu was not well. Urgently, a town representative flew to Tokyo to tell Nabu in person that Brookings had made him an honorary citizen, precisely 55 years after his second bombing. The next day, at 85 and a piece, Nabu passed away. The following year, Nabu had requested Yoriko sprinkled some of his ashes over the bomb site. A flutist played a solo, combining the national anthems of Japan and America. At the time of his death, Nabu was the only person who had bombed the United States mainland from a plane. He spent much of his life hoping no one would ever take that title from him. The end.